What's up, Sifters, and welcome to this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. We were off last week. Well, not really off. I was working on a bunch of new content. We're doing a bunch of different stuff with some of the things we do on Game Phase. It was a little bit of a bumpy week trying to figure out the productions and all that stuff, but I got it all sorted, and Ask Shane is back. If you like this show, please consider heading to patreon.com/sifted and give us a pledge at that Ask Shane tier at $7 or more per month, because so many of you guys and girls are doing that. That's why this show happens. I love doing it. We have great questions this week. Let's get to it. Okay, our first question this week comes from Raphael Michael. Hey Shane, how do you decide which games to review? There's obviously the big ones you receive codes for that you focus on right away, but what about the rest of the games? Is there a certain process you go through to pick them? Raphael Michael, this is something I've been doing for a really, really long time. Looking at the whole landscape of video games, what's coming out, what is hot, what people are talking about, and then figuring out what that stuff is, and then putting it into the shows where it all makes sense. That's kind of the gig, is looking at the landscape. Now, one thing that is an advantage for me personally is that we have a website, and that website generates data that I can access at any time. And a lot of times when we're trying to figure out what games we're going to put into a show, we look at that data. We figure out what you guys are really excited about, particularly when we're talking about smaller indie games or AA games, kind of filling out the schedule on Game Face or just the weekly content schedule. That's when we really start digging into the data to figure out what you guys are really engaging with and what you guys are into. But generally, the process is some stuff's obvious. I get codes for some of the big games, not all of them. But for a lot of the big games, I get code. Those are obvious. You know those games. You know we're going to cover them. It is the indie and the small AA, AAA stuff that is kind of the X factor. And a lot of that just depends on word of mouth, what's getting buzz, stuff that has caught my eye or Matt's eye. So as soon as we finish an episode of Game Face, production for the next episode has begun. It's like while you guys are watching the episode and commenting on it, it's already like a figment of my imagination. I am laser focused on getting the next show ready 6 days later. It is a squirrel wheel and a process, but that begins with talking to Matt, figuring out what he's played, anything that he saw that caught his eye. Same for me, and we'll go back and forth. Sometimes there are so many games in a week that he and I have to split them up, and he'll say, look, this is something I'm really interested in checking out, and I'm like, well, that's cool. I'd rather check out this other game. And so we just kind of coordinate and work together. And look, let's be honest, it's just two of us, and it's just one show a week. So there's a lot of stuff that slips through the cracks. It does hurt my soul a little bit that stuff happens, being, an editor-in-chief for many years, a reviews editor for many years, a features editor, a news editor. All these jobs that I've had, you always had to be thorough. And it's just impossible when you're working with a couple people in the budget that we have. So I do lament a little bit that we don't get to cover everything like I used to at other jobs that I've had. We just don't have the workforce or the budget to do it. But at the same time, I think it helps focus razor sharp in a lot of ways on the stuff that really matters. And another factor I would say too that does play into it now that didn't in the past is Game Pass. Because so many of you guys are subscribing to Game Pass for $20 a month or whatever you're paying. On PC, obviously, it's a lot cheaper. We know a lot of you guys have access to those games, so I do feel like it's important for us to kind of go in there and give these games a go and let you know which ones are worth downloading or spending your time on. So that's kind of thrown, I wouldn't say a wrench into the works, but a new wrinkle into things over the last couple years here. Game Pass definitely impacts the stuff that we cover or don't cover. Also, it never hurts for us as well that we have access to the games for free. Because don't forget, any games that I don't get code for, I have to buy, just like you. And so that can get expensive. All that stuff goes into what we end up covering. But mostly, it's just looking at what you guys are really interested in. Next up, we have a question from Mermelson. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Mermelson? I'm planning my first trip to America starting in mid-August. Awesome! It's going to be a month-long road trip from LA to New York with my friend, visiting Death Valley, Las Vegas, Grand Canyon, Memphis, Washington, just to name a few places. Our focus is to eat and drink well. Music is our passion, so seeing live music and visiting record stores is our second priority. Where should we eat in LA? What are some restaurants that we can find in every city and should visit? Any recommendations for live music? We have no genre limits. What about any general recommendations or tips for a trip like this? Mermelson. I literally could answer this question for like an hour. Even if I just wanted to talk to you about restaurants in LA, literally, it could take an hour. I mean, there's so much information that I need. Like, how much money do you have? That's the most important one. Like, how much money are you dedicating to this trip? If you're on a shoestring budget, that changes everything, honestly. I'm going to assume you're in the middle somewhere. You're not wealthy and you're not going to spend extravagantly, but you're also not dirt poor and you're not in risk of like your car breaking down and your life ending in the middle of Arkansas. So as far as LA is concerned, like, you know, you can Google LA restaurants. There's a few places I would recommend. I'll say this, my favorite burger spot just closed. It was this place called Plan Check, and I was devastated by that. I don't get to eat red meat that often anymore. I have to watch like how much red meat I eat, but anytime I could eat it, that's where I went. And that place just went out of business like a week or two ago, and it devastated me. But there's a really cool burger spot called the Apple Pan. It has been around since like 1930 something, and it makes the most amazing burgers. They're called these hickory burgers. So if you want to find something like mid-range that's like a big institution in LA, that's one. Another one is this hot dog stand on Melrose Avenue called Pink's. And when I first moved here, if you went to Pink's pretty much any day of the week, there was a line around the block of people waiting to get those hot dogs. Now it's not as bad. It's kind of interesting how it's kind of lost a little bit of interest. But literally, they make like 50 or 60 different kinds of hot dogs. That's a good thing to do if you're kind of trying to go on the cheap. Then just go to the beaches. Go to Venice Beach, go to Santa Monica, eat at one of the restaurants along the boardwalk where you're looking at the ocean while you eat. That'll give you the full LA experience. And then, if you want to spend a lot of money on a really nice restaurant and get the whole Beverly Hills bougie experience, I recommend going to Wolfgang Puck's restaurant called Cut. It is the best steakhouse I've ever been to, and I've been to a lot of them. All over the world, all over Las Vegas. It is the best. So if you want to spend some money and have a big night out in the town, I would go to Cut. Now let's talk about your trip in general. Honestly, the first thing I would say is, like, don't drive across the United States. Here's what I recommend, and I hope it's not too late. You may have planned your trip already. I recommend, I don't know where you're coming from. I'm assuming Europe. If you're coming from Europe, fly into New York. Get a rental car in New York. And from New York, you can drive 2 hours to pretty much anywhere you want to go. You can go to Philadelphia, you can go to DC, you can go to Baltimore. Any of those cities are all just a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours drive away from New York. Do the whole eastern seaboard in a rental car. Take like a week and a half to go see Washington, D.C. and see New York City, all that stuff. Then get yourself a plane ticket and fly to California. And then do the western side. If you want to see Oregon or Washington State, you can do that. That's a pretty big drive. But if you just want to do California, let's see, start maybe in the Bay Area, San Francisco, spend a couple days there, drive on down the one highway along the coast, down to LA, spend a few days in LA, then maybe go down to San Diego, and then I would just recommend getting on a plane and going back to where you're going. Here's the thing. When I moved out here, I drove out here, I regretted it. It was literally torture. Once you get past, if you're coming from the East Coast, and I don't know where you're landing, once you're coming from the East Coast, once you get past Chicago, it is nothing for 3 days but just cornfields. And there's really nothing cultural worth seeing. No offense to people living in those states, but like culturally, I can't think of any reason to stop. We did not stop. Once we left Chicago, we didn't stop to see anything until we got to like Salt Lake City, Utah. It's that dead. The whole middle of America, there's nothing. Maybe you want to go to Nashville since you're really into music, but even that, you could make that trip from the East Coast. And Nashville's all country music, so you did say you like all genres, but maybe you don't like country and that doesn't matter to you. So as far as music is concerned, there are no record stores. Even in LA and San Francisco, there's like one in each city. Amoeba, which is an awesome record store, but there's just one. They don't really exist anymore. There are some vinyl stores that you could dig around in, and if you're really interested in that, we can talk about that offline. But honestly, there are no record stores. And if you want to see live music, that's also why I'm recommending flying to the East Coast, do your thing on the East Coast, go to New York City. There are venues, there are shows every night in New York City. Then come to LA and do the same thing. There are literally like 10 shows a night in LA. I know you said you aren't genre specific, but any genre you like. Almost any night of the week, you can go out and hear it live. So I recommend flying to the East Coast, do the East Coast, then fly over to LA or San Francisco, do California, go to Vegas, go to Death Valley, and then get on your plane and fly back home. All right, our last question for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything comes from Liberal Hack. What's been the toughest ethical dilemma you faced as a games journalist? Oh boy, honestly, I've been doing this for, since 1997. That's when I made my first dollar from covering video games. So 27 years I've been doing this, almost 28 years I've been doing this. And honestly, there haven't been that many situations. I know people want to say journalists are paid off and all this crap, but seriously, I think I've been put in like 3 awkward positions in my entire career. I mean, it just doesn't happen. I know everybody wants the conspiracy theories, wants everyone to think that the reviews are paid off, and in all honesty, the small amounts that game journalists are paid, they really are prime targets to be paid off. Because if someone's getting paid like $35,000-$40,000 to be an editor, how easy is it to pay that guy off with I understand why the conspiracies are there. I'm just telling you, my personal experience, first of all, that's never happened, but I've only really been put in awkward positions 3 times. I've talked about the other 2 times a couple times. I don't want to bring it up again. And this third one, I've wanted to save it for my book that I'm writing. But I'll tell you a little bit about it. And then in my book, obviously, it'll go into a lot more detail. But there was one time I was at an event in Las Vegas. I'm not going to say here. I'll put it in my book what the publisher was or what the game was. But it was back in the days when like there were junkets for every video game. And they would fly you to some city. You wouldn't see the city. You'd see the airport, and then you'd go to the location where the event is, do the event, and they take you right back to the airport. But they were happening all the time, everywhere. My first few years in the industry, I had like 200 and some thousand frequent flyer miles or something. It was ridiculous. So anyway, there was an event in Las Vegas, and I don't know, there's probably 50 or 60 press there or whatever. We did the event for the game. We checked out the game. After that, they're like, hey, we're going to do like a little after hours thing up in our private hotel suite. So all the people who didn't have to immediately rush off to like do work or whatever went up into this big suite that the publisher had. And it was really nice. It was at the top of a hotel in Vegas or whatever. We get up there and we're hanging out. They ordered like some drinks or whatever. And it's just me and my usual crew of games journalists shooting the crap or whatever. And about 20 minutes into that, there's a ring at the doorbell. And the PR person goes to the door. And in walks a bunch of strippers. The PR person had ordered a bunch of strippers to come to the suite. And that was the moment where I was like, wait a minute. I'm like, this isn't right. Like if you're a trained journalist, it's embedded in you to have these alarms in your mind. And that's really been the sad part of watching what's happening to journalism now, is that these people don't have that alarm in their head, or they just ignore it. But if you go to college for journalism, they beat it into you. Like how to spot conflicts of interest in situations you might be in as a journalist that are bad. And my alarm bells just started going off. Ding, ding, ding. I'm like, what is going on here? And it was the weirdest thing ever. Again, I don't want to get into too many details. I want to put it in my book. But long story short, the strippers walked in, saw it was a bunch of nerds, and got really nervous, and then like walked out. And it turned into this awkward thing where the PR person was like, but we're paying you to be here, and you need to come in here because we're paying you. And they're like, we're not coming in there. We're afraid. So anyway, I left. And I ended up going down and playing some blackjack at the tables or whatever. And then the next day I flew out or whatever. So that was a situation where I got put in a compromising position by a publisher that I was uncomfortable with, and it's not one that I've shared before. So there you go. Okay, that's it for this week's edition of Ask Shane Anything. Head to SIFTD.net. Up there in the header, there's a link to ask questions for Ask Shane Anything. We have a few in there now, but we're going to start doing the show every week, and those are going to run out very quickly. So head up there and ask your questions. Again, you can ask about anything. I just gave you advice on how to visit America in this week's episode, and I love answering questions like that. So feel free to ask whatever you want. I'll try to answer it if I can. Thanks to everybody, all our patrons at patreon.com/SIFTD. You guys are all flipping awesome. I love you guys to death. If you want to become a patron, head on over there. For just $4 a month, you get all our content way early. But again, for $7 a month, that makes sure that this show keeps happening. So thanks again to all you guys, and we'll see you next week.